All right, everyone, here are some general concepts that you should be familiar with about nonverbal communication in your Chapter 6 reading. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the idea that just like verbal communication that you studied in Chapter 4 with language, that is that nonverbal communication is also still symbolic in nature. And what that means is that that it's based on representing something, right? We use nonverbal cues as a way often to substitute for verbal communication or to accompany verbal communication. There's always some sort of meaning to the nonverbal cues we use, but that meaning is in the person and not in the nonverbal cue, or in this case, the symbol. And so just like language, we talked about that meaning being in the person based on their experiences with the word. The same thing with nonverbal cues based on our experience with those nonverbal cues and how they're used in particular context. That is where we get meaning from those. So a nonverbal cue, one nonverbal cue doesn't always have the same meaning for everyone. Okay, so again, it is still symbolic, just like language. Here's a concept that I don't think is really discussed in the chapter itself, but it's important to take note of this concept, and that is that communication theorists say that we cannot not communicate. Okay, we cannot not communicate. So what does that mean? That means that, especially when it comes to nonverbal cues, that we are always sending messages, whether they're intentional or deliberate. And what we really have to be careful with is when we unintentionally send a message with the nonverbal cues that we use. So as it says here, even a lack of response is still a response. Let me give you an example that I like to use in face-to-face lectures in class, and that is the example of if I ask a question in class. Which often happens, and so it's kind of a realistic example. But when I ask a question, I get a lot of blank stares. And so is that communication? Is there something being communicated? Well, actually there is, right? We would think that, well, I'm not making a response, so I'm not really communicating anything. But that lack of response still communicates something. So what happens when it's unintentional is you really leave it up to the receiver of on the other end to make a decision about what that means, right? So again, it's symbolic. What does it mean to me when I get students who give me a deer in the headlight look and don't respond to the question? So it could mean several things, a few of them being things like they don't know the answer, they didn't read the chapter, they didn't hear the question, or they didn't understand the question. So in that small example, there are 4 possible interpretations of that look that I'm getting from students, even though they're not intentionally sending a message, right? So I have to decide. So I might do something like assume that, okay, maybe they didn't hear the question, right? Give students the benefit of the doubt. And so I might restate or rephrase the question and allow them to have another opportunity to answer the question that I give them. I could also easily assume, well, you know what, they didn't read the chapter, because it should be something that if they read the chapter, should be easy to answer. And so again, it's really up to me as the receiver of the nonverbal cue to determine what that means. But even a lack of response still communicates something. So it's really important to think about that when we're engaged in communication with people and we don't explicitly respond. We're really kind of rolling the dice as far as how they're going to take that lack of response. In chapter 2, you read about identity management. And the thing that's mentioned in chapter 6 is that nonverbal communication contributes to that identity management, right? So the way that we act in a particular situation with our nonverbal cues, our actions, help other people who might be observing us to get an impression about us. And we oftentimes deliberately use nonverbal behavior in a way that sends a particular message that we're trying to convey to people, because we're trying to establish or manage that identity that we want to present to others in that particular context. So that's important to also know. The truer meaning of emotions is often more easily determined by our nonverbal communication. And this is something I don't know it's necessarily discussed in depth in the chapter, but oftentimes there's a conflict between the verbal message, something we might say, and the way that we might say it, or the actions that we illustrate along with the reaction. And this is what communication theorists or scientists call a double bind. That is, that there's a contradiction between those two. An example to illustrate this would be if you go to work, for example, and you are talking to a coworker and you say, "Hey, how are you doing?" And they say, "Oh, I'm doing okay." Well, if we take that at face value and we're focused on the verbal message, right? We say, "Okay, great, they're doing great, perfect," right? Or if we are listening closely, we might be able to recognize that the way in which they said it might indicate to you that, hey, maybe they're not really okay, even though they said they're okay, right? How many times have we done that before? How many times have we not really been okay, but we've said we're okay, and our voice might have reflected the truer meaning of how we're feeling, right? So if we understand that, not only in ourselves, but in able to recognize that in other people, that's a valuable skill for a lot of us, because then we can say, okay, hey, you don't sound okay. Are you sure? So that will show concern to other people about how we perceive their true emotion. Which really leads into this next point, and that is that being able to recognize and use nonverbal cues is a big part of what the book talks about being emotional intelligence. And if you remember in chapter 1, you read about communication competence, this idea that we not only understand, but we also utilize appropriate communication in a particular situation. And we encounter a lot of different situations. So it's again that toolbox analogy, that what do we utilize in a particular context of communicating that will make us more effective than if we were to utilize other methods of communicating or other tools of communicating in that particular situation. So that's communication competence, and emotional intelligence is part of that, right? Being able to recognize not only in ourselves, but also in other people, things like the example that I shared earlier. If someone says, "I'm doing okay," right? They're not really doing okay. There's something about them, right? That's reflected in the way that they said that. So as you learn about the different types of nonverbal communication, one of them is paralanguage, and that's what's happening in that example. Is the paralanguage is really giving you a truer meaning of their emotion than the verbal message. All right, and the last thing is that nonverbal communication is culturally variant. And so it varies from culture to culture. For example, something like this, right, that we take for granted in our American culture as a sign of we're okay. If someone says, "Hey, how are you doing?" You say, right? And then we go, "Okay, they're doing okay." In other cultures, this is something that is vulgar. And so if you're not aware of that and you go to a different country and you start flashing this around, people are going to be very surprised at your lack of awareness, and more importantly, what they think you are communicating, that you do with unintentionally, because you're still using American standards of interpreting that nonverbal cue. So you have to be very careful about a thumbs up, an okay symbol, things like that we understand the meaning of in our culture as being good things. In other cultures may take on different meanings. So you have things like gestures, you have eye contact. In our American culture, our expectation is for people to establish eye contact with us and maintain eye contact with us as a sign of listening and as a sign of respect. Whereas if you encountered someone from an Asian culture and were engaged in a conversation with them, and you made that same sort of eye contact, that would be perceived as being very rude. If you've ever spoken to someone from an Asian culture and they didn't establish a lot of eye contact with you, in Asian cultures, that's that's a sign of respect. So it's kind of the opposite of our culture. But if you weren't aware of that, you would think, gosh, they're being rude. They're not looking at me. And or in that case, they're doing what they, in their culture, is very appropriate to do. Then you have things like distance as well. So there's a whole variety of nonverbal cues that we utilize that take on different meanings in other cultures. There are some universal things, right? But also there are things that are different in terms of meaning. And that's the important things that we realize that, so we don't commit these sorts of faux pas or communicate things that we don't intentionally mean to communicate to people in those cultures by utilizing things that we think are okay in terms of nonverbal cues. All right, these are things that you should be aware of from your reading in chapter 6, and the concepts there that are important to take away from that chapter.